Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking time to attend today's webinar. I'm Alex Clayton, and I work for the Pew Charitable Trust Conserving Marine Life in the U.S. project. Through this project, Pew works with national, state, and local partners to advance coastal habitat conservation and recovery through improved policies, designations, and management plans for ecologically important habitats and places. In 2018, Pew started working internationally with countries like the Seychelles, Costa Rica, and Belize to include coastal habitats in their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Accord. In 2020, wanting to elevate the role that coastal habitats could play in the domestic climate mitigation policy space, we assessed 10 coastal states, and from our findings began work in Oregon and California to help the states incorporate blue carbon habitats into their state climate mitigation policies. We since expanded to work in North Carolina and New Jersey. We know that conserving and restoring coastal wetlands and seagrass beds is a critical component of coastal resiliency and biodiversity, but these same measures can also help to reduce emissions and enhance carbon sequestration and storage. Quantifying the amount of carbon sequestered and stored in coastal wetlands is crucial for integrating these habitats into climate mitigation policies. And today you'll hear from researchers from the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center and the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group on the state of blue carbon data in the US. Before I introduce our panelists, I first want to turn it over to Pew's Conserving Marine Life in the US Director, Jennifer Browning, to take a couple minutes to talk about our work.
Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Browning. Alex, thank you, and welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody on the call. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us. As Alex noted, Pew started working on blue carbon initiatives in 2018, and since that time, we've been really fortunate enough to engage with a whole variety of partner agencies, researchers, and NGOs in several countries and states to be able to elevate the role that blue carbon can play to advance our climate goals. As a result of Pew's efforts, as well as the work of many of you on the call, together we are seeing that states are increasingly incorporating coastal wetlands into their natural and working land strategies. In Oregon, the Global Warming Commission adopted a goal for carbon sequestration and storage that explicitly includes coastal ecosystems. California is including coastal wetlands in 2 major state policies focused on natural and working lands, and North Carolina is developing a greenhouse gas inventory for its coastal wetlands that will likely be one of the first inventories in the world to include seagrass. So we're seeing progress at various different levels in various different locations, and that's really, really exciting. And so as Pew continues to sort of integrate blue carbon into state climate strategies over the coming year, we see an opportunity to really help states kind of come together to address common issues and challenges around developing blue carbon inventories, setting goals, and developing management strategies. We've heard from a lot of states that this is a need. And so we've thought a lot about how we can help facilitate this. And so actually today is our soft launch of a new state-focused community of practice where we're building a blue carbon network to create stronger connections among state agencies, practitioners, academics, researchers, and NGOs who are all working on blue climate and state climate policies. And we're hoping to achieve this through convenings, resource materials, and information sharing. So we really appreciate you being here today and joining us in this soft launch. And following this webinar, we'll be distributing a one-pager that gives a little bit more detail about what we are planning for our blue carbon network. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn it back over to Alex.
Thank you, Jennifer. I now want to briefly introduce all of our panelists. Dr. James Holmquist ended up having a last-minute family emergency this morning, and so Pat McGonigal from SERC will be filling in for him. So Dr. Pat McGonigal is Associate Director for Research at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. He's an ecosystem ecologist with interest in carbon and greenhouse gas cycling in wetlands and forests, particularly as they relate to climate change. He is the lead investigator of the Global Change Research Wetland, a world-class facility dedicated to unraveling the complex ecological processes that confer stability on coastal marshes as they respond to global environmental change. Next, we have Jackson Wolf. Jackson is a data technician for the Coastal Carbon Network and Marine Geo at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. In this position, she engages in the curation, synthesis, and publishing of data from coastal ecosystems, manages databases, and develops tools for data access and exploration. Jackson holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Northeastern University, and prior to her current position, she worked at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution as an information research assistant, collecting and publishing data for the Northeast U.S. Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And lastly, we have Dr. Chris Janowczyk. Dr. Janowczyk is a research faculty member at Oregon State University and collaborates with regional institutions to study climate change impacts to West Coast estuarine wetlands, carbon storage in coastal wetlands, and ecosystem responses to tidal marsh restoration. He received his bachelor's from UC Santa Cruz and his PhD from UC San Diego. He is also a member of the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, which is a collaboration of scientists and policymakers seeking to advance blue carbon research in the Pacific Northwest. So Pat and Jackson are going to kick us off today, followed by Chris, and then we're going to open it up for question and answer. Please feel free to submit questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get as many answered as we can during the discussion period. I also want to give a big thank you to my colleagues, Carolina and Jasmine, for helping with the logistics and planning of this webinar. So Jackson and Pat, the stage is yours, and you can pull up your slides.
Okay, well, hopefully you can see my slides. Are we good on that, Alex? Okay.
I think we're starting not from the intro.
Oh, yep, sorry. Thanks, Jackson. So yeah, let me just start by saying thanks for joining the webinar, and I'm going to be taking the place of Jim Holmquist, as you just heard. I'm a poor substitute for Jim because he's really been the lead on advancing our work on taking inventory of blue carbon data in the United States. I'll present a few introductory slides, but then Jackson, who's been right there with Jim for this work, will take it from there. So yeah, I just want to start by acknowledging our funders, which include the National Science Foundation, who funded the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network, which really launched this effort in collaboration with partners at the U.S. Geologic Survey and Conservation International and others. And of course, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, who have been supporting our work for quite a while. And I'm really excited that we've joined with Pew Charitable Trust, because I think you'll see that a lot of good has come from this, and yeah, excited to see the direction that our data activities are taking us. Well, just as a quick overview, this talk concerns inventories, and there's two major components to those. The fact that we tend to focus on most, which is that these coastal blue carbon systems store a lot of carbon, and certainly that's a fantastic ecosystem service they provide. They also emit methane, which we know much less about. And if you're going to put together an inventory, you really need to know both sides of the radiative forcing coin, the greenhouse gas coin. And the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network has been busy building a community of people who contributed data on both carbon storage and methane emissions, and has been busy developing tools that we intend to be leveraged in inventories and state level climate mitigation actions and so forth. As you just heard, there's a lot of state level interest in this right now, and that's very exciting. This is just one example that you're probably familiar with, the United States Climate Alliance, and it was originally formed in response to the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement. Even though that's changed, it's still the case that states are really the engine for a lot of the blue carbon science policy that's developing in the United States. And therefore, trying to support state level actions is an important goal. There's a variety of applications that these sorts of data can be applied to, and what we've done here is taken a figure out of a paper by Fargione et al. A few years ago that kind of really put forth the United States a very robust estimate of what could be achieved through natural climate solutions, through managing forests, grasslands, agriculture, and wetlands to enhance carbon storage, and it included aspects of both carbon sequestration in soils and methane emissions. And don't try to study this graph too closely, just take note that, wetlands rank here, including tidal wetlands, seagrass, and that while we are trying to manage these systems for carbon, these little colored bars on the left side of the y-axis represent the many other ecosystem benefits we get from this. So I think this is these are things everybody appreciates, but just important to emphasize that this is a major motivation for the work that we've been doing in the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jackson, who has really been key to advancing the work of the network, and as you'll see, has had a leadership role in the Pew work that we're going to talk about today.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks for having us to come and talk to you in this webinar. So just to outline some of the just some background on the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network. It's a consortium of biogeochemists and ecologists, soil scientists, and coastal land managers that are all working together kind of with this goal of accelerating the pace of discovery in coastal wetland carbon science. And we do this by providing our community with access to data and opportunities for syntheses and tools for analysis and interpretation of that data. So we can go to the next slide, thanks. So some of the Coastal Carbon Network data products and tools and services that we provide to outline that. So our network is very community oriented and is aimed at serving and meeting a broad spectrum of user needs, which go from basic science and syntheses, building towards the foundation of establishing projects, blue carbon associated projects and assessments. It was developed by members of the community that it seeks to serve and grows through community discussion and feedback. Some of the services that we provide are that we facilitate the sharing of open data. We offer services through training and data management and analytics, and we lead working groups that are aimed at reducing the uncertainty in coastal greenhouse gas emissions and storage. So we lead data synthesis efforts and develop tools for accessing, visualizing, and summarizing data. And the map you see on the bottom right is the Coastal Carbon Atlas, which is a web application that was developed in order to explore and filter and download data from the soil core synthesis that we curate. This is a comprehensive database of soil profiles from around the world, and it's the one that we'll be focusing on in the second half of this talk. Next slide. So in 2021, the Pew Charitable Trust provided funding to the Coastal Carbon Research Network to conduct an inventory of the database, the soil core database that it curates, kind of with this goal of creating statistics and assessments to describe the state of available data for U.S. states in the contiguous United States, which are trying to integrate coastal wetlands into their greenhouse gas indices. And the expected result of this project was the Blue Carbon Inventory Report, which I encourage you all to explore after this webinar. You can find it at that link there. It goes into a lot more detail about the methodology and our analyses, and provides breakdowns for selected states. And it also hosts a lot of the figures that I'm going to show you if you'd like to go back and take a closer look at them. Next slide. So to just introduce kind of the metrics that we use to describe our database inventory. So for effective blue carbon projects, to be established, they take a lot of preparation, and they need a lot of information to just get them off the ground. And you can't start a project without first knowing what you have in your toolbox. And so the goal of this analysis was to provide a comprehensive inventory, which is informative for a broad application of blue carbon projects and management activities. So we developed 4 different metrics to describe the contents of our soil core database at the state level. These metrics were looking at data quantity in each state, the quality of that data, the spatial coverage or representativeness of it, and the representation of various blue carbon habitats in our database. These metrics leveraged, These metrics also leveraged some Coastal Carbon Network assigned attributes, such as our post-processing steps, which assign data utility and completeness to each core, as well as coastal wetland habitat. And in the end, we use these metrics to produce a composite score and rank the states kind of relative to the performance of other states. Next slide. So this is the results from our first metric. On the right, we have, kind of how all of the states containing coastal wetlands fall in terms of, it describes the representative quantity of cores for each state. And so states that rank higher have a higher number of cores per 1,000 hectares of coastal wetland. So I've placed this next to a figure describing state wetland contribution. And so you can kind of see the difference in the wetland area versus the numbers of cores sampled. And we can see that the states in the Gulf Coast and Southeast, they have the greatest amount of wetland area. So ideally, the ideal sampling strategy kind of would reflect this wetland contribution. However, what we kind of see is the Pacific Northwest states emerging, along with Alabama is doing good as well, as the highest ranking. And this has to do with basically these states have a lot of data for the amount of wetland area that they contain, and they're typically undersampled in states like Louisiana and Florida. Even though there's a lot of cores for that, there's even more wetland. Next slide, please. Okay, data quality metric is similar to the quantity metric, but it leverages the data quality tiers that are assigned by the Coastal Carbon Network. These are categorized by 3 uses: cores containing information for carbon stock assessments, cores with dated profiles that can be used for age depth models and soil accretion estimates, and then cores with elevation information, which can be used as input for modeling and forecasting. So this metric kind of includes cores of the highest value across all of these uses, and they also need to have a complete profile of the wetland from which they were taken. So a higher score on this data quality metric will indicate that a state has robust soil core inventory with more versatile uses for various blue carbon activities. So in the figure on the left, you can kind of see that when this filter is applied, there's a rather large reduction in the number of represented states. At the top of the ranking, we can see Oregon, again with a definitive lead. So it not only has a high quantity of cores, but it also has, comparably high quality of cores. And this is followed by Delaware, California, Washington, and Massachusetts. On the right, we have a figure that kind of breaks down and gives you more insight about where the scores come from. The scales are not all the same, so you can kind of see that we have the most cores containing carbon stock information in our database, with Louisiana taking the lead on that. It's kind of due, let's see, there's also states with a great deal of wetland, like Texas and Virginia, that have little to no representation of cores with dated profiles or elevation information. It's not necessarily, bad to have, just cores with information for carbon stock assessment, but we're kind of ranking this on the amount of versatile use, basically. So next slide. Going into spatial representativeness. So this was a metric that was used to describe sampling efforts and whether they were, spatially clustered or well dispersed across each state. And with the idea that states that will score higher kind of have better coverage across state wetlands and therefore may lend themselves to a wider variety of projects and assessments. In the figure on the right, we can kind of see the juxtaposition of this in an example of a very clustered sampling in California, which is concentrated around the San Francisco region, and then a very dispersed sampling in Louisiana, which can be attributed to their coast-wide reference monitoring system network, which is a coordinated statewide effort that employs a spatially explicit sampling strategy. Okay, Washington's not far behind. So again, lots of good representation from the Pacific Northwest. Moving on to habitat representativeness. This was a metric that we designed in order to determine how well sampled habitats kind of reflect the mapped area of coastal wetland habitat that's present in each state. And so I know that there's a lot of colors going on. So the habitats that we have in our database are mangrove, tidal marsh, scrub, swamp, seagrass, and algamat. Those are separate in our database, but in the underlying mapping products that we used based on the CCAP data, we had to group seagrass, kelp, and algamat. So that's something to note for states that may contain a lot of kelp ecosystems. So in this, we can see that Florida kind of has the most proportionally. I'm looking at the figure on the right. Florida is a good example of a state that has a proportionally diverse assortment of blue carbon habitats, and the sampling has done a pretty fair job of representing them. Maine and Washington also have a rich assortment of habitats. However, they kind of rank lower in both cases because the tidal marsh is much more represented in the sampling of the available data than in our estimated habitat areas. Moving on. Okay, putting it all together, this is our blue carbon data report card, which we kind of used to tie up, all of the results and the rankings across all 4 metrics. And we used these to generate and rank states across these metrics and provide a composite score for each state. So in the top tier, we have Massachusetts, Delaware, California, and the Pacific Northwest states, Washington, and Oregon are all ranking pretty high. These states, as well as Louisiana, yes, these states came out ahead because they have a lot, or with the exception of Louisiana, these states came out ahead because they have a lot of data given the small area of coastal wetlands that they contain, and that's comparably more high quality data as well.
Jackson, can I just pop in really quick? There's a little gray box over the slides and some of the information. I'm just wondering if we can move that just so participants can, yeah, thank you, it's gone now. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Pat. So what we kind of found was that the availability of good quality data is largely driven by the contributive efforts of the individual collaborators and research groups, but Louisiana's high scores also demonstrates the benefit of having a coordinated network like CRIMS. So moving on, the Gulf states outside of Louisiana score variably fair to well, although the overall representation could be improved, and that particularly goes for Mississippi. Florida has a relatively large number of available cores, but this quantity is still underrepresentative of the large fraction of tidal wetland habitats in the U.S. that the state contains. Mid-Atlantic states, we tend to see some deficiencies that vary from, data quantity in Maine, Maryland, and New Jersey to data quality, Maryland, Maine, New York, and Virginia, and then also in spatial and habitat representativeness. We're seeing some data gaps in Maine and New Jersey. Don't be discouraged if your state is not performing the way you'd expect. This is not often not necessarily for lack of research and data collection, but for lack of data that is made available. And fortunately, there's some forthcoming data that we have for these underrepresented states, which could assist them in scoring higher, in the next inventory. We hope there will be more. So for states looking to assess and improve their blue carbon inventories, these findings kind of provide a baseline by which to enable targeted sampling efforts and measure future progress. We hope that this inventory also provides incentive for data sharing in the hopes of hosting a database, that can support a larger spread of blue carbon projects. Moving on, wanted to go over, that's all right. some of the things that kind of makes a good inventory. Oh, no, you can go to the next slide.
Okay, good.
So just to hit on a couple of points of what, will build a good inventory. First is the investment in the collection of high quality soil cores. And, so in that, by good inventory, I mean like a robust one that is capable of serving a wide variety of projects and assessments and management activities. Collaboration between researchers and networks to increase data access is really important. So, working together to synthesize existing data, committing to the publishing of new data, and making sure that this data is accessible and well documented for future use. Next, maximizing data availability while minimizing latency. And this kind of speaks to the production of thoroughly collected, quality controlled data that's combined with its timely release, once it has served the purpose of the project it was collected for. So data management plans are a great way to establish these goals and expectations. Evaluation and resolution of data gaps. So beyond the deficiencies that this inventory might reveal, also having conversations between researchers, land managers, and policymakers to recognize the disconnect, between the questions we want to ask and the data which is available to answer it. Lastly, establishing long-term projects across state and regional, even international scales will be really a good thing for the advancement of blue carbon science in the future. And lastly, to wrap things up.
So Jackson, I think we've run our time out, and maybe we could just let viewers take in this last list.
That sounds good.
And of course, yeah, it starts with data sharing. So take that in, please. And if you are interested in that, you know, please contact Jim or Jackson, because that's why we're here to grow the data we have to use. So.
Great.
Thank you, Jackson and Pat. That was really informative and helpful.
No problem.
All right, we're going to turn it over to Chris now. I think Caroline is going to pull up his slides, and then the floor is yours, Chris.
Great. Well, thanks, Alex, for having me at this webinar, and thanks to Jackson and Pat for the great introduction and kind of overview of all the work that's going on nationwide. So I'm going to drill down a little bit more and focus on the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest in particular. And I have a lot of collaborators who've worked on various projects. So I tried to list many of them here, but probably didn't include everyone. Next slide, please. So in 2014, the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group was formed. I joined the working group about a year after its formation, but the initial impetus was to have a collaboration between natural scientists, social scientists, managers, and policymakers who could advance blue carbon in the Pacific Northwest and really make data available and share it for policy and management purposes. And the working group is active from Northern California, so about Humboldt Bay, up to British Columbia. But recently, we've also been collaborating with a similar working group in California that's sort of getting its feet off the ground. It's called the California Blue Carbon Collaborative, and they've had a few meetings over the last year or so. Next slide. We've been involved in a variety of funded projects. So most of our work kind of revolves around grant proposals that are funded and that allow us to kind of move forward on blue carbon science. So from 2016 to 19, we worked on a stocks project. We also did a very small pilot scale assessment of blue carbon finance for a couple of estuaries in Oregon and Washington. We currently are in the process of looking at 2 carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions projects. So I'll show you a little bit of preliminary data from those. And there have been lots of other individual projects by a variety of government and academic institutions in the Northwest. Next slide, please. So today, I just want to kind of touch on 3 parts of what we've been doing in the Northwest. The first is our completed project to quantify blue carbon stocks and their associated ecosystem drivers. The next is a regional database. It's kind of modeled after the larger national PEW-SERC database, although the data are not necessarily completely synchronous between the two, and we're trying to help facilitate data transfer to PEW-SERC. And then I'll touch on our 2 ongoing greenhouse gas emissions projects from tidal wetlands. Next slide. So we initiated a blue carbon stocks project in about 2016. We sampled 9 estuaries in the Northwest from the Salish Sea down to Humboldt Bay in California. It consisted of 34 sites across a variety of blue carbon habitats. So we sampled seagrass, low and high tidal marsh, forested tidal swamps, which are kind of a unique ecosystem to the Northwest, and former tidal wetlands, so now kind of agricultural or pasture areas. Next slide. At each of our sites, we measured the total ecosystem carbon stock. So we measured all the soil carbon up to 3 meters depth. And then we also looked at above and below ground plant biomass, particularly trees in the forested areas. And we sampled 6 replicates at each of our 34 sites. Next slide. These are the just very brief overview of the results. So this shows the total ecosystem carbon stocks in megagrams per hectare on the y-axis, and the major habitat types that we looked at on the x-axis. So seagrass meadows had the lowest carbon stocks in our study, not too surprising given what people have seen in other parts of the world. Low marsh and high marsh had intermediate levels of total carbon stocks. And the surprise really was the very high carbon stocks in the tidal forested wetlands. So these are areas that are dominated by Sitka spruce and a few other trees that are tolerant of brackish conditions or sometimes occur in tidal fresh areas. And the other interesting finding, again, sort of consistent with other studies conducted throughout the world, is that the vast majority of the carbon stocks are actually in the below ground, so they're in the soil. The one slight exception is the tidal forest, where there was about a quarter of the total ecosystem carbon stocks that were actually in the plant biomass itself. Next slide. The tidal forested swamps, again, were kind of a surprise. They are a relatively rare ecosystem in the Pacific Northwest. So a conifer, Sitka spruce, is usually the main canopy forming species, but there are a couple of other shrubs and tree species that co-occur here. Unfortunately, a lot of the tidal swamps in the Pacific Northwest, mainly in Oregon and Washington, have been lost to development. So Brophy recently estimated that Oregon has lost about 95% of its historical tidal swamps to development. So there's a lot of interest now in restoring these ecosystems, and the high carbon stocks that they hold kind of provides additional motivation for thinking about their restoration and conservation. Next slide. With the stocks data, we also wanted to look at environmental drivers and how those related to blue carbon stocks. So this is a busy slide. You don't need to see all of this, but we know from lots of research throughout the country, throughout the world, that many ecosystem responses in tidal wetlands, including productivity, organic matter decomposition, and sedimentation, they are strongly affected by both elevation and salinity drivers. So we wanted to look at those as well and how those might relate to blue carbon stocks. Next slide. For ecosystem drivers, in order to measure those, we used RTK GPS to get a relatively high accuracy assessment of where all of our cores were taken, and we installed groundwater wells at all of our research sites to look at groundwater level as well as salinity variation over the course of a year. Next slide. So these are just some preliminary findings. The first one here just shows relationships between elevation and soil carbon. In this case, it's carbon content on the left, so the percentage of carbon in the soils, and then carbon density on the right, which is the mass of carbon per volume. And you can see that in both cases there is a moderately strong relationship between carbon content, carbon density, and the elevation of your wetlands. So in high tidal marshes, those are the ones that tend to be having the highest carbon stocks. So those could be, with this information, targeted for additional conservation or even restoration efforts. We did not see a correlation between elevation and stocks in either seagrass meadows or in tidal forest, but that may be due to the fact that we sampled kind of relatively small elevation ranges. Next slide. And this is just an example of the relationship between groundwater salinity and soil carbon. So here I just have the forested tidal swamps, and the panel on the bottom shows the change in salinity over the summer months, so a couple months of salinity data. And we had a few swamps, the Snohomish and the Nehalem, that were relatively salty. They were brackish ecosystems. And then we had 3 swamps that were essentially tidal fresh ecosystems. And you can kind of see, at least at this broad scale, somewhat of a correlation between salinity at the site and the carbon stocks they hold. So namely, the fresher tidal wetlands, tidal swamps, tended to have higher carbon stocks. Next slide. So one of the parts of the stocks project was also to create a blue carbon database for the Pacific Northwest. I think when we wrote this into the proposal, we probably didn't know much about the SERC database that was developing and evolving at the same time. So we sort of worked in parallel for a while. But when we became aware of SERC's database, we began to collaborate with Pat, Jim, and others to talk about the database, to structure it, and to essentially try to share data. And our goal really was to use the database to inform a variety of uses. So wetland managers, restoration planners could use the information, researchers could use it to look at uncertainty, policymakers, and so forth. Next slide. The initial geographic focus of the database was just the Pacific Northwest. We're going to look from Cape Mendocino in California up to Washington. But I work quite a bit in California as well, and professionally have interest in the whole West Coast. So we expanded the database where data were available to spread all the way from about Ketchimak Bay in Alaska down to Mexico. And this allowed regional comparisons of what the stocks and other blue carbon quantities we were seeing in the Northwest, how they related to other West Coast ecosystems. Next slide. For data sources, we use some of the data that already were compiled in the Coastal Carbon Atlas that Jackson talked about. A lot of data were unpublished or about to be published, and we obtained those from our working group collaborations in the Northwest. We did some literature searches which enabled a couple of new data sets. And we also even, I think, found 1 or 2 data sets by just tweeting about it and asking if people had data. So that was an interesting way to come across a data set. Currently, we're focused on soil carbon density in the database, but we're planning, and we've started to some extent to add accretion rate measurements that will allow us to calculate sequestration. And with our new greenhouse gas emissions projects, we're going to expand the database to include emissions data as well. Next slide. We have a variety of wetland types. So kind of even beyond what we sampled in our own stocks project, we're including mud and sand flats. We're including mangroves, so those would be in Mexico, not in the United States, and scrub shrub wetlands. So those are also very rare, kind of like the tidal swamps. And we're classifying the wetlands based on their kind of disturbance regime. So least disturbed natural wetlands, disturbed, restored, and so forth. Next slide. This is just a summary of the database as it existed about a month ago. I'm kind of working on this constantly, but we have about 1,400 cores in the database. About 1,300 are suitable for stocks determination, and about a third of those have accretion rate data that we could use to calculate sequestration rates. The figures below just show the distribution of cores by geography from Alaska down to Mexico, and by wetland type. And the vast majority of our cores come from emergent marsh. Seagrass is the next well sampled. And we have some data from woody wetland types, mangroves, scrub, shrub, and forested, but those are relatively rare. Next slide. So one of the questions we're asking with the database is, how do soil carbon stocks vary by wetland type? Very simple question. Next slide. And this is just a preliminary box plot of carbon stocks in just the top 30 centimeters of the soil column as distributed among these wetland types. So from left to right, we have tide flats, seagrass, emergent marsh, scrub shrub, forested wetlands, and mangrove. The sample size are in the blue numbers on the very top, and then the median carbon stocks values in the black text on the bottom. So really had large differences among the wetland types. One of the interesting things to come out of this is the fact that the tide flats seem to hold about as much carbon as the seagrass meadows, which is interesting. We have extensive tide flats in some of our estuaries in the Northwest, so they're clearly holding a lot of carbon, as well as the seagrass meadows that tend to be nearby. Marshes had about 4 times higher carbon stocks than seagrass meadows, and then the woody wetlands, kind of as we saw in our more limited stocks project, had even higher carbon stocks. And these patterns kind of hold for when we calculate stocks to 50 or 100 centimeters depth, but the sample sizes are smaller because there aren't as many cores that go that deep. Next slide. Another question we're trying to address is, how do soil stocks vary spatially? We have spatial information, including elevation, for the vast majority of the course. We can start to look at some of those questions. Next slide. And this is the pattern of soil carbon stocks by geographic region for both emergent marshes on the left and seagrass meadows on the right. And so I don't want to go into too many details here, but you can kind of see, at least for emergent marshes, that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of latitudinal trends. We have tropical marshes in Mexico, in Chiapas, and Baja California, and then all the way up to Alaska. It doesn't seem to be too much of a latitudinal trend, which was interesting. Next slide. And one other way to look at spatial variability is to kind of look at different scales. So the figure on the right shows carbon stocks for just emergent marshes, just one habitat type, to 30 centimeters. And the box plots are in an increasingly small spatial scale. So the very left is the whole Northeast Pacific, all the 700 plus cores in the database on marshes. Then we have just California, then we have just San Francisco Bay, and then we have just one large marsh complex in northern Sassoon Bay called Rush Ranch. And you can see actually that the median carbon stocks don't change too much. The variability, at least if you look at the top of those boxes, which is the 25 and 75% quantiles, they don't change remarkably so. So we're going to look at this in more detail, but this is something that the database is enabling, kind of similar to what Jaxine's been doing in terms of looking at the spatial clustering of data throughout the country. Next slide. Okay, so in the last, I'm probably a couple minutes over, I'll try to go through these quickly, but I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of some of the greenhouse gas emissions work that we're doing. These are ongoing projects, so everything I show is very preliminary, but we've been funded by the Neuroscience Collaborative as well as NCASA and NOAA to look at emissions among different wetland types and to look at relationships with environmental drivers. Next slide. So we have a whole slew of sites in 6 estuaries. We worked at some of the same places where we did the stocks project. We're working from the Salish Sea down to southern Oregon. And the point of this table here is just to show that we're sampling across broad salinity gradients and across broad wetland class gradients as well. Next slide. We're measuring greenhouse gas emissions with portable chambers and gas analyzers, LICOR and gas met analyzers. We look at both light and dark fluxes of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. We have 6 chambers per site, and we're measuring over the course of a year. And the figure below just shows the change in methane concentrations over about a 10-minute period, or a little bit longer than that, where we're actually measuring the slopes of those concentrations to get flux rate estimates. Next slide. And we're measuring a whole variety of ecosystem drivers in connection with the emissions, including groundwater, pH, soil temperature, and so forth. Next slide. And this slide and the next one just show some very preliminary results from some of our sampling. We're going to be completing it this spring. So this looks at how fluxes of methane vary by wetland type. We have high marsh, restored marsh, tidal swamps, and pastures. And the thing that jumps out here is the relatively high methane emissions from pastures. So these are areas that used to be tidal wetlands that are no longer under full tidal hydrology. They have over an order of magnitude higher methane emissions. And so this information can help us target restoration opportunities and gives us the motivation to say that if we restore some of these former tidal wetlands, we're likely to drive down methane emissions. Next slide. People have been working on the question of how salinity relates to methane for a long time. We wanted to look at this in detail as well in the Pacific Northwest. So here we've ordered 6 different marsh sites. These are all emergent marshes along a salinity gradient from essentially a tidal fresh marsh in the lower Columbia River all the way up to a relatively saline site in the Coos Bay. And you can see that our freshwater and our oligohaline wetlands have higher methane fluxes as expected, but actually relatively low methane fluxes kind of at higher salinities. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a concluding slide of concluding points. So we found that stocks varied quite a bit by wetland type and with elevation in the Northwest Pacific. Specifically, we identified woody wetlands, those temperate forested tidal swamps, as being really high areas of very high carbon stocks. There is considerable variation within individual estuaries and within individual sites. You can't necessarily use a single stocks value to quantify an unknown site that hasn't been sampled. For our emissions work, we're noting so far that methane fluxes are highly variable within wetland types, and that the pastures in particular may have pretty high methane fluxes, which provides an opportunity to reduce coastal emissions if those areas can be restored. Okay, I think that's it. May have an acknowledgement slide, but I know I'm a few minutes over time, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was great. All right, we have about 10 minutes left, so we're going to move into question and answer. If the panelists don't mind, if you have the bandwidth to turn your cameras on, that would be great. All right, so looking at the Q&A, someone asked if this report card, including the grading metrics and background info, is publicly available on a website. Jacqueline actually went ahead and popped in the link to that report. So if you go into the Q&A box, you'll find a link there to the report where you can find all of that information that CERC presented on. So I just wanted to call attention to that. I have a question for CERC folks. So the national report card that you guys showed was great. Is this going to be updated on an annual basis?
I can answer that. Jim Holmquist here. Sorry, I popped in a little late. First of all, thanks Jackson for doing just such an awesome job on that presentation, and thanks for Pat for stepping in. I had a bit of a family emergency and missed the first chunk of this. So the answer with whether this is going to be a consistently updated product, we really want it to be. To be fully transparent, we're kind of on the last year of a 5-year funding cycle, and we really need to develop. We have ways of going forward and keeping staff around, but they're all kind of under new project development and and developing new things, and we're really looking for a partner that can fund us to upkeep a lot of our basic services that we've brought to the community over the last 5 years.
Great. Thanks, Jim, and thanks for joining us.
We're still trying to get funding for things like that.
Yeah, understandable. Another question in the chat was, this is all fantastic data. Are you observing any instance of federal and state policymakers applying this information? I can at least answer part of that. So Oregon, for example, just released their first natural working lands inventory, inclusive of a blue carbon inventory, and they used data from the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group that is now also in the Smithsonian's Coastal Carbon Atlas to develop their inventory. And the state is now using the blue carbon inventory to, using the inventory to now develop kind of forward-facing goals for conservation and restoration of coastal habitats. So they're in the process of that. And I know, at least from my participation on a working group, that New Jersey has also cited the CERC report in the development of their first natural working land strategy as well. So states are, becoming aware and are definitely using this information in the development of their inventories. Pat, did you want to speak any more to that? I saw you had answered a little bit in the chat.
Well, I think, yeah, my response in the chat was that we hope to inspire those sorts of things. So the fact that you had 2 examples is exciting.
Great. Someone else asked, are cores collected by NRCS, so Natural Resource Conservation Service, part of USDA? Are they part of the blue carbon mapping included in the Coastal Carbon Atlas?
So I did drop a answer into the chat here, and I wanted to know if specifically Mathia was talking about the giant data set from Nolick and Tennessee a few years ago. We do have all of the cores that are coded as tidal from that effort in the database, but if there are more cores from NRCS from different projects, I would love to know about them and know where they are and get them slated to be ingested into the database.
Hey, Jim, I might add, I was had an email exchange with Amanda maybe a month ago, and she indicated that there's some new samples available. So there may be another large data set you guys can add.
That sounds good. I like seeing the numbers jump up.
That's great. So this was kind of also answered in the chat, but maybe we can get a little more elaboration. So someone asked, this is all very cool. Are you seeing any challenges and barriers for researchers in uploading their data to the Atlas? And Jackson, I don't know if you want to touch on this one, since I know you really facilitate a lot of that data integration.
Yeah, I mean, as Pat mentioned, that it's kind of like a discussion, that we have on an individual basis, because these data sets are very, unique in the way that they might have been collected. And so we kind of want to work with people, one-on-one. But yeah, usually the biggest hump to facilitating, data sharing and contribution is getting the data. And so getting, but also communicating to get enough information to make that data usable, by someone who's just, pulling up a data release and trying to figure out, how to use it, how to use the data that, they haven't maybe collected. So in addition to publishing the data, also making sure that it's well documented. So that can, mean that we need to have, some back and forth discussions. But I've been working, that's kind of for bringing existing data up to speed. But, for the future, if, folks are collecting data and they're interested in contributing to this database and want to, align their data to our database structure, we have templates available. I'm happy to follow up with the link. We actually have a Google Drive that I can drop into the chat, where it kind of lays out all of our templates, and also our database structure. It outlines, all of the column names and their meanings and units and everything. So hopefully it'll be self-explanatory. I don't know if anyone else had a follow-up on that.
Just that, we work with a lot of people's data and we've seen it all. So if you're at all shy about, your data being messy or poorly formatted, don't be shy in front of us. We're like doctors. You can't show us anything that embarrasses us. We've seen it all. So.
And I'd like to add one thing too, is that the database is designed to acknowledge the work of the people who collected the data. When people download data, the citations to the original work comes with the data. And there's also processes, where the data can be held until it's published. So a lot of, we really have worked to make this a trust relationship. And so that's one barrier that people often have to sharing data.
Right.
Yeah, we've even gone so far as, if Chris puts together a synthesis of different studies, different previous studies, and submits it to our network, we don't just cite Chris's synthesis, but we cite all of the original studies within there. So we have a nested chain of credit going all the way back to the original data collectors. That one of the few things that you agree to by downloading that data, and is that you maintain that chain of credit. And even if that means having just a giant works cited section, you cited all those original studies.
Thank you all. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We still have a ton of questions left in the chat. So thank you to all our panelists who have answered some of those in the chat as well. We will be following up in about a week's time with the recording and some further information. We can link to all the data presented today in the webinar. And as Jennifer Browning noted earlier, we'll follow up with a one-pager kind of explaining more about Pew's new Blue Carbon Network. But yes, thank you to all of our panelists today for taking the time. It was really informative and helpful. And yeah, thank you all for participating.